We're going to be looking at validation, which is a very simple concept, exceptions, and thread safety. Validation is a very straightforward thing, really. No doubt you're already very familiar with it. It's the basic idea of don't use duff data. We will need to check data values before we use them, especially if they're input data values, and make sure that we only use correct data values. But of course, that word correct has got some meaning that is subjective to the application that we're working on. For example, if an insurance company decides that it will set insurance premiums to be a multiple of the applicant's age, then the input data is going to have to include the applicant's age. And therefore, if we're going to validate it, we have to know what correct means. In this application, it could well mean something like the applicant's age must be an integer, because we're going to represent it as a number of years. And that integer must be greater than or equal to 1, because we've decided we're not going to insure anybody under the age of 1. The applicant's age must be less than or equal to some maximum value, which might be as much as 130, 140, whatever the Guinness Book of Records says is the age of the oldest person. Second example though, an archaeological exploration company decides that it will categorize sites by age of oldest artifact found. Therefore, input data is going to have to include artifact age. So this time we're inputting age, but it represents a completely different kind of age. For example, if we're going to record the number of years, and if we're doing some archaeological stuff or maybe geological stuff, age is likely to be very large. And therefore we might have to record it as a long value instead of an integer value. In the first instance, that differs from the first example by data type. The range of permitted values, in this case, will start at 0 instead of 1 in the previous example. And we'll go up to some maximum value, but that maximum value is likely to be very much greater than 130 or 150. I hope that you get the idea from this, that when we're validating something, it depends on the context in which we're performing the validation as to the definition of correct. So you're going to have to work out, presumably by talking with your clients, what correct means. And then you perform the validation. When the data comes in, you check it to make sure that it falls within the accepted ranges that you've been given. And if the data is acceptable, then of course you go on and process. But if it's not acceptable, if it doesn't fall within the validated range, we have to report the problem. And the first thing about reporting problems is that we have to make sure that the messages we use are clear and polite. There's been stories in the past of developers who, for fun, will use rude messages to report problems, just for their own amusement or the amusement of their testing colleagues. And then they forget to remove the rude messages so that it goes out into production, gets distributed across the organization, or even worse, across the world, if it's an internet application, for example. And then the rude messages crop up for the real clients. And that is not an acceptable situation. So my advice to you is, even when you're testing and developing, make sure that your messages are clear and polite from the beginning. And if possible, you should also suggest corrections so that we, the users, can identify clearly what the problem is and what they should do about it. If possible, continue processing. Don't just stop for any old reason. Continue processing wherever possible. And it might be, for example, appropriate to ask the user to re-enter and just keep re-entering until the user gets the message and gets it right. Sometimes that's not possible. Other times you might want to assume a default value. If the input data is invalid, assume some kind of default value and then process with the default value. The strategy that you use is going to depend very much on what your client wants. So you'll always have to do this in consultation with the client. If you're going to perform validation, it means that you've got some business rules in place. And the business rules are implemented in the model components of our MVC architecture. Therefore, it's the model components that will do the validation of the data. And they then will report back to the controller component the outcome of the validation. And there are two basic ways in which this can be done. Either using a status bean or an exception. And later on, I'll show you examples of both.